Now we're going to have a presentation on Beaufort Securities and ShareSoc's campaign for Beaufort Securities, what's going on at the company. Mark Bentley is leading that campaign, ably assisted by Mark Laubert, one of the ShareSoc directors, and Nandish Haria, who's sitting in the audience. And it's an amazing turn of events and well worth your attention. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm Mark Bentley, an ordinary investor like yourselves. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the sorry tale of Beaufort Securities, what the implications are for all your portfolios, what ShareSoc is doing about it, and what you can do about it. So first of all, let me begin just by doing a little survey of the audience. If I could have a show of hands. First of all, how many of you have already joined our campaign on Beaufort Securities? Okay, so about a third of the audience. And secondly, how many of you have the misfortune of being clients of Beaufort Securities? A few. My sympathies. Okay, so on with the business. So first of all, for those that aren't already familiar with it, Beaufort Securities was a full-service stockbroker. Now, there were some warning signs which I think we can all learn from here. First of all, in 2016, the FCA restricted Beaufort's discretionary fund management activities. Then in late 2017, the FCA imposed a restriction on receiving and holding client money or assets. Then the denouement occurred on the 2nd of March this year, when the FCA placed Beaufort into insolvency, appointed PWC as administrators, and US indictments against the company and principals in the company were announced, basically for operating pump and dump scams on US OTC securities. Shortly after that, I wrote a blog for ShareSoc, which some of you may have read, questioning why it took the US regulators to uncover this. And I've since written to Marcus Studdard, the head of AIM, to ask him to investigate whether similar things were happening with the companies that Beaufort was an AIM advisor for. Now, at that point, it seemed, and in response to questions that I received, that client assets, as long as there hadn't been fraud, should be relatively safe. That's what everyone thought. Pretty much every broker website will have information about the security of your assets, and I would imagine that before you sign up to any broker, this is something you would look at. What I'm showing here is an example from the interactive website of what their site says, which boils down to the fact that your assets are held in trust, and if the firm became insolvent, they're protected from the firm's creditors. You would think, based on that your assets are safe if something like this happened. Well, unfortunately, that's turned out not to be the case, as I'll explain in a minute. When it became clear that the ring fence that is supposed to exist didn't really exist, John Lee, Lord Lee, raised a question in the House of Lords. As another private investor like ourselves, he was as shocked as many others were to find that assets weren't in fact safe. So he asked what was the legal basis that the administrators of Beaufort were going to try and extract money from client assets. And the response from the government was that there'd been a statutory instrument introduced in the wake of the financial crisis, which allowed administrators to do that. I mean, the fundamental purpose of the statutory instrument was, in case of bank insolvencies, to provide a mechanism for assets to be returned to their owners as promptly as possible. But they left what appears to be a glaring loophole, as you'll discover in a moment. So, once this process began, information started dripping out of PWC, the administrator, and at the beginning things looked reasonably good. So of course what they had to do was to go in and basically just check whether the assets that were supposed to be there really were there, that there hadn't been any fraud and there weren't any missing assets, which obviously, had that been the case, would have been a problem for everyone. And they concluded reasonably quickly that it looked like, broadly speaking, everything was there. There were a few minor discrepancies, but nothing that ought to worry anyone. Then a couple of weeks later, the bombshell dropped. Yes, everything's there, but it might cost us up to £100 million out of the 550 million of assets to sort this out, which I think to you as well is an absolutely unbelievable figure. And as a result of those costs, that accounts with a portfolio value greater than 150,000 could suffer a haircut of up to 40% to pay for those costs. So, I mean, I would imagine you're as shocked as I was to hear of that, and even worse for those of you unfortunate enough to be Beaufort clients. I should just add that for accounts below 150,000, it's currently believed that any shortfall would be covered by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, the FSCS. So, what we did next. Now, as I say, initially we were concerned about what Beaufort had been doing and the implications for investors in the companies that it was a nomad for. But when these issues arose, it became apparent that there was a much bigger problem, and one that could affect all of us potentially if any broker became insolvent. And we, at Mellow 2018 up in Derby, we started receiving some approaches from Beaufort clients asking for assistance, essentially. And I mean, we had been reluctant to take this on because there are only 7 directors of ShareSoc, and we're all totally busy already, as you might imagine. There are a lot of campaigns going on. We all have a lot of work to do. So I have to own up that we were a little bit slow off the mark because it wasn't clear how we were going to run the resources for what looked like and has turned out to be a huge campaign. But we did take the decision that we would launch a campaign, and Muggins here agreed to pick up responsibility for it. But I have to say I've been very ably helped, first by our chairman, Mark Northway, who's been looking after the legal aspects of this, by Mark Lorber, another co-director of mine, who's been dealing with the financial implications. And shortly after we decided to establish the campaign, we met one of Beaufort's substantial clients, Nandish Hariya. Could you stand up, Nandish? This is Nandish. We met with Nandish, and he's done an absolutely fantastic job for us as campaign coordinator. So obviously has a big personal interest as well. I mean, how we came across Nandish was that he'd actually started his own sort of mini campaign. We met with Nandish, and we all agreed that we could help him a lot more with the resources that ShareSoc had, and it's worked. I hope you feel it's worked very well for all of us. So one of the things we were able to do once we launched the campaign, we have a large database of press contacts, so we could put out a press release and get the story out, and that was highly successful. There's been a lot of reporting of this issue, which has driven the campaign. Also, as a result, we made contact through various channels with a number of substantial clients of Beaufort. More on that in a minute. We're in very close contact with Lord Lee, and I think Mark may have an announcement to make about that after this presentation. And we've received informal legal advice about the strategy we should adopt into sorting this out, basically, for clients. And as I will explain, we arranged a meeting with major clients shortly thereafter. So what are the objectives of our campaign? So first of all, we want to take control of this administration process. As I said, PWC have said that it could cost up to £100 million. We know that for an administration of a smaller broker, but still one with 300 million of assets, so not that much smaller, the administration costs were 4 million. So where on earth, well, below 4 million, so where on earth do they come up with this figure from? So we need to take control of this. Now, the legal entity that holds the assets on behalf of clients of Beaufort is a company called Beaufort Asset Clearing Services Limited, BACSL. And that's the legal entity that the special administrator has been appointed to. So as I say, we need to take control of those costs, and if PwC won't cooperate and get the costs down, then we want to look for a change of administrator to a firm that can do it at a reasonable cost. Also, what one would have expected is that reasonably promptly, the shares would simply be transferred to another broker that everyone's accounts should go to. I mean, it ought to be a reasonably straightforward process. So we need to explore with PwC what they've done in that respect so far and whether that can be expedited. Another factor is there are two entities that are in administration, or at least two. One is BACSL, which I mentioned, but there's also the brokerage itself, Beaufort Securities Limited. And those are two entirely separate factors. So, of course, there are creditors of Beaufort Securities as well, and we want to make sure that any costs associated with the administration are strictly segregated. So costs to do with the administration of Beaufort should not get charged to Beaufort clients who are involved solely with BACSL. Then there's this question that smaller clients may suffer no losses at all, whereas larger ones could suffer losses of up to 40% of their portfolios, which sounds patently unfair. So we want to make sure that the costs are apportioned fairly between clients, whatever costs there are. And obviously the first objective is to keep those costs down. Then, as I'll come on to, there are a number of questions that the FCA needs to answer about the way they've acted about it. So we want to review what they've done and get that looked at as well. And then we want to review these special administration rules. As I say, there's clearly a glaring loophole in them which we want to get plugged. I mean, the view that a number of us have is that the costs of the administration should simply be borne by the FSCS. And then, of course, it would also be the FSCS's responsibility to keep those costs down, and they're much better placed to do it than clients of Beaufort. So where are we on the campaign? Well, it's got off to a flying start. We now have well over 200 members of the campaign. 40 of those are large accounts of the more than £150,000, so likely to suffer losses. And we've solicited donations because we may need to employ legal advice, and we've received more than approximately £7,000 of donations so far, and a further commitment from a major client of another £5,000. So we've got it's still small compared to the potential legal costs, but it's a good start and allows us to do something if we need to go down that route. What happened next? So as I say, the campaign was launched on the 2nd. On the 8th of May, we arranged a meeting with substantial clients and representatives of clients. In that meeting, we established that between them, they represented more than £80 million of assets. Which is obviously a meaningful number and quite important when it comes to voting in meetings, which I'll mention, because just as in shareholder meetings, votes by poll are weighted by number of shares you hold, in creditors' meetings in an insolvency, votes are weighted by the number of assets that you hold or are owed. And in that meeting, we discussed the tactics and objectives for the client creditors meeting. Just 2 days later than that, on the 10th of May, a crucial meeting was scheduled by PwC for clients and creditors of the two companies, which they're statutorily obliged to hold before they can progress with the administration. So we needed to work out our tactics for that meeting, which was crucial. One of the key things that flowed from that second meeting is the selection of candidates to sit on what's termed the Creditors Committee. And the Creditors Committee has important powers. They can basically have good visibility of what these costs really are and can negotiate them with the administrator and control the administrator and potentially can replace the administrator. So this Creditors Committee is incredibly important. So as I say, we identified 3 good candidates for that committee. Okay, what happened in the client and creditors meeting? I chose this slide. It was somewhat explosive. Nandish was there, Mark was there. As you might imagine, excuse me, there were a lot of very angry clients of Beaufort there, and PWC came in for a lot of stick, which was to be expected. So there were 3 main elements to the meeting. First of all, there was quite an extensive Q&A session, a lot of people quite rightly asking questions about all of this and how these figures arose and what was actually likely to happen. Second key, well, there's one part that isn't mentioned on this slide, which was the meeting had to give permission for the administration to proceed, but we received informal advice which Mark Northway had arranged, and the advice was that we should not vote against that, because if we did, it would then go back to the court and it would delay the whole thing. There would be extensive costs. Much better to just get control of the creditors committee and then be able to control the process thereafter, rather than trying to block it at this point, which just wouldn't work. So the second element was then selecting the members for the creditors committee. At the start of the meeting, 30 people came forward wanting to be on the committee, and that was informally whittled down to just 5 and 6 observers, and we had all 3 of the people that we wanted were amongst those 5. And then there was a ballot held to ratify the selection of the candidates. And lo and behold, we won the first battle. We got all 3 of our preferred candidates on the committee, which effectively means we now have control of the administration process. Pretty scary, but that's where we are now. And now the real work begins. The priorities now are, first of all, to understand and push down these costs. It can't be anything like 100 million. We've got to sort that out. Though we understand PwC have already spent 6 million on this. They're still employing 37 Beaufort staff, and they've got 30 of their own staff working on this. Why we fail to understand, and we have some idea, but it's just ridiculous. So we need to get that under control. Then obviously, having controlled the costs, we want to arrange for the return of assets to clients as quickly as possible. And as we mentioned previously, to make sure that the costs are allocated fairly between the different sizes of accounts. And then ultimately, take measures that will stop this ever happening again for any of us, which is clearly important for all of us, because things can happen to any broker. Though, I'm sorry, something I should have mentioned very early on when I went over my slide of events leading up to the insolvency of Beaufort, it was clear from that there were warning signs, and all of us should be heedful that, you know, if you find that the FCA is imposing sanctions to your broker, I think the message seems to be switch brokers as quickly as possible. So it's worth keeping an eye on that. Key questions we have for the FCA is, as they knew there were questionable issues, why did they wait so long? I mean, of course, that meant that there would have been more clients signing up to Beaufort who effectively the FCA was putting at risk by not taking action sooner. Second key question is, how was PwC selected? One of the what turns out to be one of the most expensive administrators they could possibly have appointed. Why did they choose them? And what discussions did they have with PwC about the costs of administration and the methodology on appointment? And a further issue that's been brought to my attention is, did they need to put Beaufort into insolvency? There are claims that the company was actually solvent. So couldn't this have been done in a much better manner, for example, by simply getting another broker to take it over? If they weren't happy with the directors of Beaufort, then just insist that it goes to another company, just as the Bank of England used to act when a small bank went insolvent. They'd solve it, but just by getting another larger bank to take them over. Which is why we didn't have any runs on banks between the 19th century and Northern Rock.
They can just then to suspend their license unless they transfer to somebody else.
Precisely. Besides the actions that the creditors committee takes, and we will be following and guiding on closely. For information, we've got a meeting set up next Monday before the first meeting of the creditors committee with those three members of the committee to discuss and agree what they're going to do on that committee in order to accomplish the objectives that we have. So aside from that, key issues that we're focusing on, first of all, our shareholder rights campaign, which Cliff, as well as RBS, is also running that one. I said we're all very busy. Now, the key point about that campaign is that it will ensure that beneficial owners of shares are directly registered with the companies that the shares are owned with, rather than with this convoluted nominee account system we have at the moment. And that would essentially eliminate this risk, or could eliminate this risk. Roger is actually investigating some aspects of this, technical aspects, but it ought to, in that the shares are no longer held by the broker as they are in law at the moment, but would be held by you. So if the broker went insolvent, it shouldn't make any difference. So the shareholder rights campaign is crucial. Do get behind that if you haven't already. Then secondly, as I've mentioned previously, we need to have the government looking at these special administration rules and the coach and horses that they drive through the current ring fence. And we're taking action to get that looked at, not least through Lord Lee, who is, as I've mentioned, raising questions in the Lords already about it. And then finally, we don't want to let the FCA get away with this. They have, as I've mentioned, serious questions to answer. So that's what ShareSoc is doing. What can you do? Well, there are a number of things. First of all, show your support for what we're doing by joining the campaign. The quickest way to get there is if you just go to our website, sharesoc.org, then put in the URL /Beaufort. That takes you straight to the campaign. Or from our homepage, under the campaigns, you'll see Beaufort at the top there. Nandish composed a draft letter template that you could use to write to your MP, asking them to make the legislative changes and explaining why they're needed that we're asking for. That is under review at the moment, and we'll shortly be publishing it and writing to all our more than 4,000 members, asking them to write. As I just indicated, if you have shares that aren't in a SIP or ISA, SIPs and ISAs have to be held in nominee accounts, you have no choice. But if you have shares that aren't in a SIP or ISA, we would strongly encourage you to use a CREST account instead, where the shares are registered in your own name, and that brings you a whole raft of benefits beside the extra comfort that you're registered and not the broker. If you go again to our website, have a look in the advanced section of the ShareSoc Investor Academy, you'll find a very good article that Roger wrote on how CREST accounts work and how to sign up to them. So all the information is there for you. Then finally, as I've indicated before, do keep an eye on your brokers. Any announcements like this, anything that might suggest that they're not entirely secure. If they're private companies and not public ones, then you can go to the company's house records, check that they're making profits, that the balance sheet is strong. Obviously, if it's a listed entity, that's even better. You can see their financial results and satisfy yourself that they've got sufficient assets and are unlikely to become insolvent. So that's essentially it. I'll open up now to any questions that anyone may have.
Just before we a couple of points on the way through. The other figure in here is 4 years. PWC estimates that it's not only going to cost 100 million, but it's going to take 4 years for these assets to be distributed. And the earliest distribution is going to be in September, and then they will distribute in phases. That is causing huge stress to private individuals who have shares and assets with Beaufort, assets that are properly ring-fenced and protected. We have one campaign member who's unable to pay his mortgage and has actually been I'm not sure if threatened with or received a CCJ already. We have a significant stress running as a result of this. It says join the campaign. Join the campaign whether or not you're a Beaufort client. You don't need to be a Beaufort client to be supporting this campaign. But ultimately, we don't think the FCA has covered itself in glory here. Doesn't seem to have been a competitive process. The news flow has been handled particularly badly, and they've been cooperating actively with the FBI, potentially to the detriment of UK investors, and we don't think that's what they should have been doing. We certainly don't think that PwC has covered itself in glory, even if the estimates here are, for some reason, correct at 100 million and 4 years. Surely an announcement as to what you're going to do should take into account the possibility of sales of the nominee account, transfer of the nominee accounts, various things that have been done in the past. I mean, there's a precedent in the case of Fish, Hoyt and Finney, which Mark mentioned before, where the total cost of the insolvency to clients was around 3 million, simply because the assets were transferred to a third party who took over the responsibility. So yeah, this is a major debacle. Questions, please.
If I may, on the issue of nominee accounts, I've experienced my broker refused to buy shares certificated. So I went to another broker, so at least my nominee account with them is quite big. But they also have declined to have personal crest accounts. They're saying they're not doing that anymore. So I wonder if that's an area we all need to worry about. On the Beaufort thing, the company that holds the nominee accounts, presumably the liquidation of that should be the costs of that, one should be able to claim in the liquidation of the other company within the Beaufort group.
Well, the problem there is there aren't sufficient assets in the other company to pay for it, and the administrator is essentially saying, and the legislation says the money has to come from somewhere, and the only somewhere is the client accounts as things stand, though, as I say, another somewhere is the FSCS potentially. So that's the problem.
Yeah, your assets in a ring fencing process, your assets are protected from the creditors of the brokerage company, and that part of it is working. Unfortunately, the legislation which protects them opens them up to being plundered by the special administrator themselves. So another issue here is that the special administrator of the nominee is also the administrator of the securities company. So he is not that opens up a degree of conflict, which to my mind would be far better addressed by having two administrators, one for the brokerage company and one for the nominee account. The nominee company, by definition, unless there's been fraud going on, its assets and its liabilities match. So the only shortfall is the cost of redistributing property to the owners, which logically is a very small shortfall, and that's the shortfall that PwC is motivated to charge as much for as they possibly can.
Are there two separate shareholder committees for two separate companies?
Yes, there are creditor committees.
Maybe we could have separated.
I think it would make sense to do so.
Yes, it's entirely possible in law. There's nothing to stop it being done that way, and as Mark says, would clearly be better.
Hi. Has it been confirmed that there's been no fraud? Has that definitely been confirmed?
No, in short. But okay. What has been confirmed is that the assets pretty much match what they ought to match.
There are some small anomalies in the nominee account, which indicates that to the extent there's been fraud within the securities company, it hasn't been a fraud which involves misuse of client assets. I mean, I think the fact that the FBI is involved with investigation of Beaufort Securities suggests that all is not well in that company. But PwC have confirmed that, barring some small anomalies, the assets and liabilities of the nominee company are broadly in sync.
Right, and let's say there's no fraud. Let's say that does get confirmed. Does that not then mean that for brokers running these type of structures that they're not adequately capitalized?
Well, there's no capital in a nominee company, and that's the issue.
to pay the expenses.
Exactly. That, as Mark says, that's precisely the issue, that there isn't a capital buffer within the nominee. There's a capital buffer within the parent broker. They're required to hold a certain reserve, but
the FCA, what I'm saying is that reserve, which the FCA require the brokers to have, is just not right, because it doesn't cover this type of situation.
Well, it's a good further question that could be asked, but clearly, if the costs really could come in at 100 million, I mean, it's unrealistic. The broker's not going to have a reserve of 100 million when they're managing 500 million of assets. Because remember that they're managing them. It's not like lending out with a bank.
There's a couple of questions there. One is the reserve that's in the brokerage company available to pay the expenses of administering the nominee account company? You would assume that equitably it should be, but that's to be confirmed.
Yes.
The other thing is the sizing of that capital is generally, it depends on the license of the broker, somewhere between 3 and 12 months of operating costs. But the suggestion here is that the FCA has perhaps let this company continue to operate longer than it should have done, whilst allowing the FBI to get on with its investigations. So it may actually have impaired the situation by doing so. Roger.
You mentioned that the rules were laid as a statutory instrument before Parliament. Now, as I understand it, that means basically they don't get any review by Parliament. They get written into the minutes of Parliament, but nobody looks at them. There's no debate on them. So basically, the Insolvency Service have pulled a fast one here by getting that in.
In short, yes.
And from my experience of the Insolvency Service, it's run by ex-insolvency practitioners, and this is just another example where they're totally incompetent. Things like
they're totally competent. They've protected their own interests wonderfully.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean,
they're competent at that.
You're absolutely right, and the most telling thing was that Lord Leo Trafford, who is in the Houses of Parliament and who is one of the most well-known investors in the UK, was completely unaware of the ability of a special administrator to do this. There have been 6 special administrations, but they've all been resolved by a transfer of assets, and this is the first one where, I mean, generally they've been resolved by special administrators as well. This is a Big 4 company, and he's going for gold. These guys have simply said, you know, the till is open. I'm going to put my hand in, and they've handled the PR around it incredibly badly as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Just on the specific points you raised there, Roger, there's a couple of things. I did have a look at that aspect of it. What you said, I don't think is entirely true. That I think. Secondary legislation like that is reviewed in committee, not of course by full Parliament. But the good news is that if it can be introduced that easily, it can also be revised that easily. It doesn't require an act of Parliament to change it.
I'm not sure that there's any scrutiny in committee of those kind of regulations.
That's what it says on the parliament.uk website. Something like that.
Yeah. Okay, anyway. And this is definitely something we want to look at. But I think the first focus has got to be to try and ameliorate the situation for Beaufort investors. The second one is to try and change the regime so that this can't happen again. But in the meantime, there is genuinely a question as to whether or not brokerage is safe. Ring fencing. The assets are correctly ring fencing, but ring fencing does not protect the investor. That's got to be the conclusion. So if your broker fails financially, through regulation, for whatever reason, if that broker ceases trading, you are likely to lose a large percentage of any assets that are above the FSCS compensation limits, and therefore you need to review your brokerage arrangements. And Mark was saying, look at the financials of the broker. I mean, I'd go a stage further. I'd say, unless the broker is attached to a large financial institution, a bank or the like, then it's open to the same situations, the same issues. Mark.
Another thing to mention on the way through, you mentioned that some people are not getting their dividends and coming to financial difficulties, and that's more on the passive side of what's happening on the portfolios, that dividend income comes in. There's also no capacity to deal with active decisions that need to be made on the portfolio. Sales of assets, purchases of other assets, but more importantly, things like rights issues and option exercises. And this is value that's actually being destroyed because there's no capability to take care of that in the meantime.
And has been being destroyed for some time because the prohibition on new money going into Beaufort accounts has meant that exercise of options, for example, couldn't take place unless there was cash on the account. So people have been losing value for some time on this. Any more? Bruce?
I'm surprised that there wasn't a sort of living will or something like that within Beaufort. 'Cause when I was involved in running a brokerage, we did need to have a plan as to what would happen if, God forbid, anything happened. Yeah, so I'm a little surprised that there seems to be something that's changed within the FCA that means that there isn't such a living will in existence with Beaufort.
I'm not sure even if it existed. First of all, if it existed, would it cover the type of closure, the type of misbehaviour of the directors that we've seen? But I'm not. But I suspect even if it does exist, it just assumes that ring-fenced assets are ring-fenced assets, and there isn't an issue there. This is the first time that this has raised itself, really. So you would assume in your living will that client assets will be returned to clients, and that the cost of doing so will be relatively minimal.
In the situation I'm thinking of, we had to have a plan in place that should the license be revoked or anything like that, very, very quickly, all the assets would be moved to another brokerage. So I'm just very surprised that wasn't. This doesn't exist.
It's a good question, and we should feed it into the.
So to my mind, you should be knocking at the FCA's door. Why the hell haven't you got this in place for every single brokerage?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
We will be. Thank you, Bruce. Very good point.
Banks used to have insurance against fraud. I'm not sure if this is quite relevant fraud here because the company's insolvent. But I've seen the policies. They used to have it against all sorts of wrong behaviour. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's relevant or not.
Well, it's another question that could be posed to the FCA. Are these insurable risks?
About professional indemnity, right? Yeah, the administrators say those have been exhausted. The claims are way too much. So it's near its limit.
Yeah, in terms of claims against Beaufort, the directors had signed a solvency statement, believing it was solvent. Liquidator indicated that notwithstanding, they believe the actual shortfall was maybe in the order of £1 million. And somebody made a comment from the floor at the meeting that, well, for £1 million, you're going to incur 100 million quid to sort the mess out. To which he replied, well, with a sort of an embarrassed shrug, but also said, well, he believed there were about 700 compensation claims coming in as well. They had already arrived, and they were arriving on a daily basis. And surely that would have sunk the firm.
Yeah, but interestingly, that million shortfall is presumably a negative capitalisation of $1 million rather than a shortfall relative to regulatory capital. So again, the implication is the FCA has allowed this company to erode the reserves that it's supposed to be carrying, which are there to deal with precisely this situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, there are a series of questions that need to be put to the FCA here.
I have been looking carefully at this issue about how to protect against this situation in future, because I've got a fairly sizable portfolio. I've already been using 3 different brokers, and I've just opened another account with Barclays because I'm pretty sure Barclays are not going to go bust, although it's not the greatest system. But I've also been looking at this issue of using a personal Crest account because I already have some personal Crest accounts. And I still have yet to confirm that the assets will be protected there, and I will be advising you further on that. Of course, the other way would be to have a paper share certificate, which I think is still available from some brokers. I've still got some, and there would be no risk whatsoever. But clearly, if you've got if you've got a decent-sized pension, if you need a pension pot of way over £100,000 to get any decent income, so it's very, very difficult in practice to actually protect yourself against this risk.
The interesting figures here are probably
Sorry, yeah, the point you make about pensions, that's one of the issues we want to emphasise in our letter to MPs, that the government clearly wants to encourage people to save for retirement, but if they face this risk, it has precisely the opposite effect. So they've got to do something about that risk.
A SIP will be in a nominee account with a broker, so you'd be vulnerable from that.
Yeah,
precisely.
The same applies to ISAs. If you
yes,
have £1 million in an ISA.
Yeah, and suddenly take 40% of it. Yeah.
I think there's an interesting figure here, which is the 150,000. PwC assumes that accounts below 150,000 will suffer no loss because the FSCS will cover 50,000 of losses. So that's probably a good benchmark to say 150,000 per broker is a safe number.
That doesn't help me much.
No,
there's quite a few brokers around. Cliff.
One of your slides suggested hold your shares in Quest accounts, and the Shareholder Rights Directive suggests that the end user should be on the share register in future, and the way the UK government is interpreting the Shareholder Rights Directive, sorry, this is boring, but it's actually quite important.
It's very important.
Is that they're going to harmonise in such a way that they won't change the current rules, which means that they won't be following the intent.
They're ignoring a very useful element of that directive.
Absolutely, they're planning to ignore that intent of that directive, and so I think we should be campaigning quite strongly that we have the end user on the shareholder register.
Yep.
And so that's going to be a good idea because it will restore individual shareholder rights. But my particular question is, would it have worked in this case? Would it have helped individuals in this case?
Well, I think that will depend on exactly how that legislation is framed ultimately. And there we could have useful discussions with Link, who would be experts on those sort of matters. But just to emphasise your point, Cliff, there are actually two letters we'll want you to write to your MPs. One about this issue of how these insolvencies are handled, and then secondly about the issue Cliff has just raised, that we need to get BEIS to act properly and implement the shareholder rights directives in such a manner that you do end up having your name on the company register in some fashion.
The clearer it is that the assets belong to you, the more difficult it is for somebody to say, I'm going to charge you a huge chunk of assets to give them back to you. So it can't, it certainly can't hurt. And in terms of companies wanting to communicate, I think Cliff is looking at attending a load of AGMs and saying to the company, why don't you support this process? Because it's in the company's interest to be able to communicate directly with its beneficial owners, and it's in the beneficial owners' interest to have their names on that register. So I think both sides it's the government that needs a kick on this.
As well as writing to our MPs, should we be encouraging our members to write to their brokers, asking them to confirm how secure or otherwise our assets are with them in the event of an insolvency?
You'll get a very anodyne answer because the brokers don't think there's an issue at this stage, and they simply point to the lettering at the bottom. We're FCA compliant. They have the brokers might, if people start querying their brokerage and start moving accounts, then I think the brokers will wake up and think, well, hang on a minute, there's something.
But certainly it's worth people writing to their brokers, expressing their concern with Beaufort and asking them to lobby for legislative change to get these special administration rules changed, as we're suggesting, because it damages their business interests.
Two more, Mark.
Just very quick. I spoke to a smaller broker that I used about a week ago, and he used the expression "storm in a teacup" to describe it to me, and I repeated the concerns and so on. Storm in a teacup. I spoke to him again today on a very different matter, and he is very, very concerned about it. So the message is getting through. He's hearing it from a lot of places.
Great.
Thank you.
I went to the FCA yesterday and told them about the lack of competition between brokers on this issue, and their ears pricked up when I said they were behaving anti-competitively. And they realise that there is a potential problem there, so we need to keep lobbying the FCA.
Mark, Nandish, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mark.